Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. Russia's latest drone assault on Kyiv left homes in flames, even as Moscow's top envoy sat down with President Trump's special representative in Miami to talk peace. At the same time, Washington's new sanctions are expected to slash Russia's oil profits by up to 30%. And global attention is shifting toward China's potential role in ending the war. We're now joined by Hanna Shelest, Director of Security Programs at Ukrainian Prison, to discuss the latest developments. Good to have you back on TVP World. I want to start with, right away, these attacks over the weekend. Again, terrible images as we've seen before, Russians striking civilian targets in Kiev. We're looking at 29 injured, but also the response by Ukraine. So what do we make of these developments? Are we edging back into more conflict, or what's your take from the weekend?
It is the late autumn, so we have the same pattern that we saw the two previous years when, in the middle of autumn, Russia are trying to target predominantly civilian objects, first of all, the energy infrastructure. And as you can imagine, the civilian energy infrastructure is usually in the residential areas, so you have all these dramatic collateral damages over there. And that's where you see the geography, not only Kyiv, but all around Ukraine, with the electric stations, hydroelectric stations, and the heating station, because we are now coming to the cold season. All of these is with the same ideas as the last year, to bring more fear, to push Ukraine for probably surrender as Moscow see it, and to create unbearable conditions for the Ukrainian economy when it really needs to be developed, when there are less international support.
Mm-hmm. Hanna, you said the idea is like to bring more fear towards Ukraine, but at the same time, if we're looking at, I think, early hours of just today, we've seen also Ukraine strike targets in Russia. Many were shot down, I think over 193 near Moscow, but nevertheless, there were injuries. So is this element also playing into the Russian psyche? I mean, Ukraine is now able to strike from time to time into Russia. Will this impact Putin at all in terms of some kind of negotiation in the near future?
Definitely, Ukraine already for at least a year were able to target with the different type of the drones, plus the Ukrainian-made Neptune and Flamingo missiles, the Russian territory. We had limits only for the US-made missiles to be used against the Russian territory. But the targets are predominantly the refineries, the military production facilities, and the military bases. And considering that during the Soviet Union times, that was normal to build your military production facilities just in the middle of the city, we see it all around the Soviet territory, not only in Russia. So definitely the Russian air defense are trying to intercept them. And unfortunately, it's always some of the debris that are falling around. So the airports is the only civilian object that probably we can say that Ukraine is also trying to disrupt. And that's understandable. We need to demonstrate that we can reach the Russian territory, but without casualties. So in this case, the same what Russia is doing against the European airports, Ukrainian drones are coming against the Russian airports. As far, it's not only Moscow, but this night, yeah, we saw the pictures from Moscow.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I mean, if we're just looking back at the weekend, it was these strikes that were perpetrated by Russia first against Ukraine. And as you mentioned, civilian targets, energy targets. Also, I'm just curious what you think of this meeting then we had in Miami with, on a high level, from the Russian side, meeting also the top aide, Mr. Witkoff from the Trump side, and Mr. Dmitriev's statement here saying, telling U.S. media that a diplomatic solution is close, but yet we have these strikes against civilians. When you hear something like that, how much of a mixed signal, how much, if anything, trust could be built on such a statement by them?
First of all, I would not name these meetings a high level, and we should not overestimate them, because to come for the high-level negotiations, as it was mentioned in the Russian media, when all the leadership making decisions in the sphere of the foreign policy are out of the country, like Mr. Rubio, for example, or Mr. Bassett in terms of the economy and sanctions, Mr. Trump, that's quite strange. Let's use this word. So it was more of this aide meeting. We know that they had confidential meetings before, and the meeting with Witkoff is exactly because Mr. Dmitriev thinks that he can influence Mr. Wittkov, as he did previously during the Moscow meetings, because Mr. Wittkov doesn't know the real substance, the core of the Russian-Ukrainian relations, and he just would like to have a deal as the president ordered him. But at the same time, that is the certain dichotomy in the statements from Mr. Dmitriev. On the one hand, there is no problem with sanctions, there is no way for the negotiations, but he is traveling and requesting these media. He is asking with his advocacy interviews at the different media, exactly the MAGA media, because he would like to influence the public opinion. So, I mean, that is the classical strategic communication when you're trying to advocate to take off the sanctions that are really painful and to persuade that there is still hope for any type of negotiations, and it is not you who are the bad guys after Anchorage didn't fulfilling any of the agreements being reached between the two presidents. So I think that this trip we should consider not as negotiations, but exactly as the lobbying and advocacy trip from the Russian side, trying to change the public opinion among the near circle of President Trump, but at this understanding that Mr. Trump is becoming more and more frustrated with the Russian president.
Mm-hmm. I mean, having said that, and also with that meeting shelved now between President Trump and also President Putin, looking at any sort of near future, do you see a return to some kind of diplomatic solution in all this, or are we at a stalemate, at a deadlock? Where do we go from here in your mind?
You know, in the theory of any type of the negotiations, two sides are needed. You cannot negotiate with yourself. So we knew that the positions are very different, and they are really dramatically different in some of the issues. But at the same time, if two presidents are sitting and they're agreeing on something, they expect that it would be a certain delivery. What we saw after the Anchorage, it was the overuse in Russian media of these nice pictures from Anchorage, but the situation on the ground just jeopardized. It became worse. So the negotiations for what? The meeting for what? Again, to make a nice pictures for the international media, to show that Russian president is accepted by the American president. Probably Mr. Trump can be a soft-hearted towards the Mr. Putin, but he is not idiot. Yeah, he is not stupid to be used just for the PR campaign of the Russian president. So if Russians are not ready to come with the real changes to the situation on the ground, for the real agreement, at least we are not speaking even about the big ceasefire, but let's negotiate on some small part, for example, something not targeting the energy infrastructure of two countries, or not like change the situation around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. In this case, we can imagine that, yes, Americans will be ready to meet again.
Mm-hmm. And also, speaking of presidents sitting down and pressure, I'm just curious also what you make of now in the last week. We've had quite considerable things come out of the United States. President Trump has now said these sanctions will go against these two major Russian oil companies. Scott Bessa said this could be affected up to 30% of Russia's oil profits. Do you think that's going to be enough now to pressure Vladimir Putin in some way? Is this now one of those leverages where Trump is finally going to succeed here in making a deal? What do you make of it?
You know, it's definitely not enough, but it is really significant, both economically and politically. First of all, these sanctions are already overdue. We've been expecting them at least 2 years ago. That was really strange that the biggest companies in oil sector that brings the biggest income for the military machine are not under the sanctions. So that's like with delivering some types of the weapons to Ukraine. We finally received it, but it was already late for dramatic change of the situation on the ground. But at the same time, politically, it is very important signal, because since January, the Russian side tried to do everything possible for the Americans not to introduce new sanctions. They were saying that it would ruin negotiations, that it would be the escalations, and all other different arguments. So they really hope that they can pressure the American side not to do it. When finally White House made this decision, that was a signal that, look, we did it, we crossed the line, so we already have the second package and the third package. If you're not ready for the negotiations, we are ready to introduce the further sanctions.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I think that works quite well in parallel with the European Union's 19th packet of sanctions. So I think this is going, Europe has always done a little bit more with this, so I think that's going to work nicely together. I want to also ask about sitting presidents. We have Donald Trump on his Asia tour at the moment. He will be traveling and meeting Xi Jinping. China is going to be be very much on the top of his agenda. And of course, the war in Ukraine will be likely discussed. I want to ask you, first of all, a quick quote from President Zelensky. This was at the European Council, so all the leaders came together in Brussels just some days ago. And he said at a press statement, I'm quoting here, "China helps Russia, it doesn't help Ukraine, and it's not interested in our victory." How much is that going to be part of that chat between Trump and Xi Jinping? Will he now be able to also make China come on board here and pressure Putin at all?
I doubt that China would pressure us for now because they see the situation a little bit different. But the phrase of President Zelensky is what all of us experts and politicians been talking at all the roundtable security conference, closed door conversations for at least 1.5 years. Because we already knew that the Russian military machine been able to work because of the Chinese spare parts, because China buying Russian energy resources, and even supply of the military equipment to the Russian Federation. Without Chinese support, Russia would not be able to continue this war. The problem is that China doesn't care about Ukraine, despite all our pre-war relations. For them, it is the triangle Moscow, Beijing, Washington. So because they had such bad relations with Washington for all this time, it was just impossible strategically for them to support anybody who is connected with Washington and against the Russian Federation. They needed Russia stronger as the leverage against the Washington. So I'm afraid that without solving the difficulties in American-Chinese relations, it would be impossible to persuade China to press the Russian Federation. Mm-hmm. The only thing where China is still taking, I would not say neutrality, but really strategically important position, it is the use of nuclear weapons and nuclear security in general. Because we know that each time Russian side is speaking more and more about possible escalation till the use of the nuclear weapons, it is Chinese who is saying that that is the red line that can change the situation.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I'm curious because you're saying it will only really matter if and how the U.S.-China relations go, if those are safe. But at the same time, I think within the last 24 hours, we have big news, this framework that's supposed to be discussed, that now 100% tariffs are off the table against China. I mean, Trump seems to want to sweeten the deal. Is that maybe in your mind not going to be enough to also then get what he wants, which is more pressure on Putin, or is that a pipe dream in your mind?
Unfortunately, it is not enough because we understand perfectly that these tariffs really had brought problems to the U.S. companies. So China understands that these tariffs were a very tricky decision. Yes, it influenced China, but it also has influenced significantly the production inside of the United States and a lot of the U.S. business that been producing in China, but then selling, especially the high-tech companies who produce a lot in China and then delivers it to the U.S. So this deal is important to the U.S. the same way as for China. That can be a first good step. It can be a melting in the frozen relations a little bit. But for going wider in terms of the foreign policy, I'm afraid that would not be enough.
Mm-hmm. So then, just in conclusion, after this week, after this round trip to Asia, Trump visiting all these different places, now he's in Japan, he's going to be meeting Xi Jinping. Where do we stand in your mind after this week? What are we going to have after all this?
I definitely hope that it would be reassurance of the Indo-Pacific partners of the United States of the security guarantees that they had. Because let's be honest, with all these hesitations of the support to Ukraine, both China and South Korea are really worrying about the U.S. support. So with growing Chinese and North Korean involvement there, these countries are waiting for the closer dialogue with the United States and assurance that they are not alone in the region. So that's definitely would have a significant impact, and I hope that it would be in the positive mood after this, because as you see with tariffs, with relations, unfortunately, the biggest problem with the White House is not their pro or anti position for something. It is their unsustainable position, that it is changing too much. So I believe that this trip and the statements we would have after this will influence the next 6 months of the regional affairs, but also would have the indirect impact to the European affairs as well.
All right, so we'll see how it goes. It's going to be an interesting week ahead for sure. Look, thank you so much. That was Hanna Shelest there from Ukrainian prison. Appreciate your insights today. And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay tuned right here. There's much more coming up on TVP World. Goodbye.